Today is February 17th, 2022, and before we get to today's episode, I have some fun housekeeping work to take care of. First of all, I plan to do an episode coming up on greed, discussing Adam Smith and Leo Tolstoy. The Tolstoy will be taken from his short story, Master and Man. It is a fabulous story, but to avoid spoilers, you might want to read it before the conversation. We'll link to the story in the notes from this episode. I also want to share the results from the listener poll of your favorite episodes of 2021. By the way, you can find past favorites, the results of past year's polls, by going to EconTalk.org. Along the top, you'll see a bar. It's teal colored near the top that includes browse by category. Use the category Favorites Annual Top 10 to find out past episodes, past year's favorites. For 2021, here are the top 10 episodes, which is actually 12. Number 10 was a three-way tie. Sebastian Junger on Freedom, Lamorna Ash on Dark Salt Clear, and Don Boudreaux on Buchanan. Number 9, Jason Riley on Race in America. Number 8, Tyler Cowen on The Pandemic Revisited. Number 7, Dana Gioia on Learning, Poetry, and Studying with Miss Bishop. Number 6, Megan McArdle on Belonging Home and National Identity. Number 5, Mike Munger on Free Markets. Number 3, a two-way tie, Daniel Shoup on Parking, and Mike Munger's second appearance in the top 5, Munger on Constitutions. And a tie at number 1 for your favorite episode of 2021, Sam Quinones on Meth, Fentanyl, and The Least of Us, and Rowan Jacobson on The Truffle Hound. I want to thank the 1,300 or so people who voted. Many thanks. And now for today's guest, psychologist Angela Duckworth. She is the Rosalie and Egbert Chang Professor of Psychology at the University of Pennsylvania and the founder and CEO of Character Lab, a nonprofit whose mission is to advance scientific insights that help children thrive. She first appeared on EconTalk in July of 2016 talking about grit. Angela, welcome back to EconTalk.
Russ, it's good to be with you.
Tell us about Character Lab. What's it do?
Well, Russ, I started Character Lab. It's a nonprofit about a decade ago. Met two educators who said, as teachers, we have this intuition that there's all this science coming out on motivation, on emotion, growth mindset, gratitude. I wonder, each of them said to me separately and then in a chorus, I wonder whether scientists should get together with teachers and also with parents and share some of the science of human development, because it would make us better. It would make us better teachers. It would make us better parents. And I thought that was a great idea. I was just starting out in some ways as a, young professor. I thought maybe this wasn't the wisest use of my time from a strategic sense. But, I usually just do things that I have a gut instinct are the right thing to do. So we started this nonprofit. We called it Character Lab after Aristotle. And character, I think, is a polarizing word. But then again, what's not polarizing these days? I'm a fan. So I'm on the side of character, because when Aristotle said that the good life, the life that's worth living is a life that's good for others and good for yourself, as much as for others as for yourself. And when he talked about virtue, I think essentially he was talking about all the ways of thinking, feeling, and acting that we habitually do that are indeed good for others and good for ourselves. And I think character has another historical reference that I think of every time I say the word, and that's Martin Luther King, who, when he was just 18 or 19, he was a college freshman at Morehouse. And he said, if you think about education, the purpose of education, character plus intelligence, that is the true purpose of education. So we think that the science of human development, all the ways that kids learn to grow up to thrive for themselves and for others, that's worth having a nonprofit dedicated to. And what we do materially is we connect researchers who study, mindset and gratitude and curiosity and learning and more with teachers to do research, but also with teachers and parents to share research findings. And it's been about a decade, and I'm, not only on the side of character, I am on the side of science. And I think when you ask the question, what will be different about the 21st century? And when you ask the question, why should we be hopeful about the 21st century? To me, there's a revolution in psychological literacy based not just on intuition, but based on science.
Yeah, long-time listeners, even probably short-time listeners, I'm a little bit skeptical about the scientific content. We may get into that in the course of our conversation.
I'd love to get into that.
But I want to start with a more basic question about character itself, which is we're going to be talking about an unpublished essay that you shared with me called The Big Picture. And one of the things you say in there is that character is an old-fashioned word. I would say even more strongly, it's a word that's out of fashion. It's a concept that's out of fashion. The idea that education, that teaching, and that development should inculcate character is out of fashion. And in fact, I would say looked down on as often a negative. What are your thoughts on that? And do you, are you thinking of the word differently than they do, or in a similar way?
I think
and just defending it.
Yeah, I agree with you, Russ, that character is for many people, not only old fashioned, but out of fashion. Some would argue not only out of fashion, but should be out of school in particular. And I'll take the stance that if you look back historically, of course, that wasn't always the case, right? When children learn to read, very often when you ask like, well, what stories are we going to, give to children as they learn their letters and their sounds, so often there were these like essentially moral tales. And I would contend that to this day, children's stories very often have a moral to the story. You teach them about honesty, you teach them about kindness, you teach them about courage through these stories. And I don't think that's wrong. I think that's very right. And I think there is a place, of course, a primary place for that to happen in the family. Parents teaching their kids the values that are important to live by. But I think that the crucible of character development also includes school, which is where children and teenagers spend, so many of their waking hours, right? And it's the second most, frequent place that a child finds themselves after the home. And I think when you ask the question, like what role specifically should schools have in character development, I think, and I reflect on my own childhood and my own upbringing, next to my parents, my teachers and my classmates were my role models. And absolutely to this day, I remember certain lessons that I learned from teachers and from peers as well, that made me who I am. So I think character development is in some ways old-fashioned, in some ways out of fashion, in some ways could be argued with. But I think that if you say, well, schools are no place to teach honesty, persistence, optimism, gratitude, then what you're really saying is that we're just not going to do it intentionally, because young people are going to learn those lessons from the people around them one way or the other.
It raises an interesting question. In a way, what you just said is so inarguable. Who could disagree with that? Who wouldn't want their children to be kind and honest and grateful, just to take three nice virtues that we like to think our kids could acquire? And yet, it does seem like it's out of fashion. Why would you think that could be? What has happened to education that, especially in the K through 8, K through 12 level, why is that controversial? Any ideas? I haven't thought about it. Any ideas?
I think there are two reasons, one more obvious and one less obvious, about why some people want to kick character development out of school. The more obvious argument, and again, I don't agree with it, but the argument is that schools should not be the place where you teach prescriptive norms. In other words, what ought to be, values, what's right and what's wrong. That's a matter of personal choice. That's a matter of family choice. And of course, you can point historically to times in American history where the teaching of, values, how you should believe about other people's race or sexuality, you can certainly point to episodes in history where that has, taken a dark turn. But again, I think the vacuum, pretending that there is any such thing as a vacuum. I mean, let's take honesty, for example. And again, I'm going with this most obvious cause for the backlash, if you will, against character development, but I'm not agreeing with it. If you say like, well, honesty is something that's taught in the home, by mom and dad, and, there's no place to discuss that in the classroom. But if there's cheating in the school and the teacher says, X, or the teacher says Y, or the teacher says Z, I mean, you are teaching something about honesty, whether you like it or not. There's an implicit curriculum for character development. I'm arguing that it should be more intentional and not accidental. And I am arguing, and here too, I'm sure I have opponents. I believe that there is scientific research on, what the brain does when you tell a lie, and how we come to be honest people, how we perceive honest people, and every other dimension of character as well. So I'm not only arguing for character development to be more intentional, but also more based on research, which we can get into, because I'm not saying that every scientific finding that's been published is true. But I want to, Russ, say something about the less obvious counter current against character. And I think in some ways this is actually more from the left than from the right. So there is a kind of a conservative element of like, well, that's not for schools. I really want this to stay in the home. But on the progressive side, on the left wing side, there is a kind of the word character sounds like it's fixed. It sounds like blame the victim. And if you take a very progressive liberal stance on education, you could also resist that phrase. I find the left likes a term which I think is roughly synonymous, which is social and emotional learning. So if you've ever heard the initialism SEL, that's a term that educators use a lot. I don't think parents use it as often. But that's a kind of more minor quibble. That's kind of a quibble with terminology and a desire to note these personal qualities as things that are less fixed, and also that allow there to be in the picture, society and structure and so forth, none of which I disagree with.
But it's a deep question, which we'll get into in a little bit, about this question of fixedness and whether a person can build character, whether a person can change themselves, and whether some people are more able to do that because of their situation rather than some. We have this, I think, a little bit of romance about our innate ability to pull our emotional well-being up by their bootstrap. I don't even know how to. I'm going to stop that metaphor. But the other thing I wanted to observe, though, that I think is interesting about what you're saying about the school versus the family, is that school has that unique opportunity where you're interacting with lots of people across a wide range of intimacy. At home, they're all your family. They're your parents. They're your siblings. In school, you've got your close friends, your pretty good friends. There might be some people you're enemies, people you don't like, people who bug you, people who annoy you. And I think one of the virtues of a character-based educational system, if such a thing is possible and desirable, one of the arguments you'd make for it is that it's a lab. It's a place where you can actually see a wide range of human interaction that you want to get your children good at.
Outside the family, I'm Chinese, as you know, and Confucius, at least the way I was taught. So I hope I'm not misinterpreting Confucius, but Confucius, I was taught, said that all morality begins in the home. And so because you cannot kill your brother, but you want to, you learn what it means to be a kind and civil person. And then you just extrapolate that to the people who are outside of your home. But one could make the argument that much of character development, much of becoming a person who is good, who shows up in the world for the good of others, actually happens outside of the home. And Character Lab is a name we chose to emphasize science, but you could make the argument, just thinking about it as you're talking to me, Russ, that school is a character lab, right? And you're right. You have, as Confucius said, people that you sort of want to throttle, but you can't inside the home. But absolutely, when you are in junior high school, like think of all the people that you really wanted to, push or shove or do something not so great to. And then you learned not to do that. I do think also that you learn to have empathy, with people that are your friends, but also, not quite your friends, but your classmates. So there is a lot of character development. I mean, in education, we just think about, how we grow up to be the people that we are. I think one thing that I would agree with the Aristotelian view is that character is a habit. Character is not something that you either have or don't at birth, but it's, crafted over a life. And I think that, so much of who we are when we grow up is because of those early school experiences. And I remember to this day, conversations, not only teachers in particular, like literally specific conversations. I had a English teacher, Mr. Carr, and it was just, I tracked down a classmate. I mean, I graduated from high school in 1988. I had Mr. Carr twice, once my, I think sophomore year and I think once my senior year, but definitely it was 2 years out of 4. And I went and tracked down one of my classmates from when we were seniors. So this is now, 3 decades more ago. And I was like, do you remember that time where we cheated on that test? I think it was Faulkner, could have been the Grapes of Wrath. And we were trying to remember, but he was like, oh, you mean that test that he gave us where like, remember Mr. Carr liked to take random vocabulary words out of the book and ask us to like, remember where they had appeared and to define them. And I was like, oh, if my memory serves, I feel like on one of those things, like we cheated, like he left the room and everyone was like, what the heck is this? And my recollection was that Mr. Carr came back into the room and without raising his voice, gave us that kind of like withering, I'm disappointed in you. You have failed me. Look, that made me think to myself, I will never ever in my life cheat on anything. And those indelible conversations, right? Like that to me is character development that happened outside of the home.
Yeah. Well, I think I've mentioned Miss Kineen on this program before, which is my 8th grade teacher, and she had an impact on more than my character. A lot of the people in that class were changed by her. And I did track her down and wrote her a long letter decades later. I recommend it if Mr. Carr is still alive, and thank him.
I did. I wrote it, and I got some classmates of mine to also write letters of gratitude. Yeah.
Excellent. So your work, a lot of your work, your last time we were here on EconTalk, you talk a lot about grit, about perseverance, which is clearly a character trait. What do you think we've learned about whether grit can be and perseverance can be taught, learned, and so on? Obviously, human beings are complicated. We're a mix of traits. Some of our traits are more immutable than others. Some people have trouble sticking with tasks. Others relentlessly buckle down. Can grit be improved? And you've, of course, thought and done work since we first talked on this. So where are your thoughts these days?
I like, Russ, when you said, can grit be improved? Because there's a little hesitancy with can grit be taught, only just in that, it sounds like you're teaching someone, like how to play tennis or solve an algebra equation. And there's something about grit developing that feels like, oh, the teacher just saying, oh, like this. And, the student saying, oh, right, like that isn't quite right. But I strongly believe that grit can be encouraged. I strongly believe that grit can be improved. And I do actually believe there is a role for a teacher in the development of grit. I have, since writing that book, of course, felt that, which I did before I wrote the book, that grit's not the only thing that should be encouraged or taught or developed. But when you ask the question, can it be? I've created a course called Grit Lab. And the class is an undergraduate class. I now teach it to Wharton MBAs. And actually last year, I started teaching it to high school students. And the idea of the course is that, everything that I do is really just trying to understand and reverse engineer achievement and effort, right? Like when somebody does great things, what do they do? What are their habits? What are their mindsets? What are the skill sets they've developed? And the idea of reverse engineering is simply that if we can demystify achievement, if we can say, look, what you didn't see in the YouTube highlight reel was that they did this in the morning, they did this in the afternoon, they did this on the evenings, this is how they had conversations, here's how they developed relationships with mentors. And that's what the course is. It's a class where there's, 14 topics. We talk about the science of interest, which is, of course, the seed of passion. You can't stay with something for very long unless you're interested in it. We talk about the science of values and the magic of doing things that really feel aligned with your personal identity and your aspirational personal identity, the person you want to be. We talk about the science of deliberate practice, how experts get better in the most efficient way. So what does high quality effort look like? We talk about mindset and resilience, the stress response, and more. And I think, to me, if you ask, why did you create this course called Grit Lab? To me, I think that beyond nudges, the behavioral economics approach of changing behavior, make retirement savings the default, check off the box, so that when someone gets to that part of the form, being kind of lazy or just making assumptions that everybody else has checked off the box, they just go with it. Or put the water bottles at eye level and put the soda out of reach. These nudges, I think, have enormous benefits. They're cost effective because they are nearly cost-free, and they can make small changes in human behavior that are beneficial. But to me, the idea of character and character development is changing the person, not just changing the situation. And that has the possibility for enduring benefit and for, I guess, for lack of a better word, spillover effects, right, in other realms of your life. And as a mom, of two daughters, I'm not out to kind of like architect their environment so that all their choices end up being optimal. I'm interested in developing two young women who, everywhere they go, have a character that will enable them to do good for themselves and for others. So Grit Lab, I think, in some ways, is my attempt at character development in an intentional way. And I'll say, Russ, one other difference, and it was very purposeful on my part, is that nudges happen to you. Nobody has like a big sign up that says like, hey, we're about to default you into retirement savings. In fact, one could argue that the nudges work better when you don't notice them, right? But my class is exactly the opposite. It's an elective. You have to take it. It doesn't count for any major, in other words. And when you enter the class, I say, this class is designed to teach you the science of passion and perseverance for long-term goals. And it is designed to change you. So if you do not want to change your passion and perseverance for long-term goals, there's nothing wrong with you, but you probably shouldn't take this class.
Yeah, so I love that. Or part of me loves it. There's a part that doesn't love it. And let me talk about both. I think a large part of growing up is learning who you are and who you want to be, which are I hope two different things, because
hopefully there's a little space there.
Yeah, we start off unformed in so many ways. And one of the deepest things I learned, I'd say, in the last 10 years came from a conversation with you. And I put it front and center in my new book, Wild Problems, which is this insight of Harry Frankfurt that we don't just have wants or desires. We have desires about our desires, or we can.
Second order desires, he calls them, right?
Yeah, and that was that essay of his, which we'll put a link up to, is a hard essay, but it's accessible to any thoughtful person. It's a really fantastically provocative idea. And so that idea of figuring out who you are, which is very complicated. You have certain labels you can describe yourself, but your deep, your flaws, your strengths, learning to see yourself that way, somewhat from the outside, is very challenging. And then once but if you're able to do that, you can then imagine who you might be. And that, to me, is in many ways what life is about. It's those two things. And it's hard to teach those things. And if you're not careful, and I would never accuse you of this, Angela, but I want to see if you agree with me, the whole idea of a life hack, the whole idea that, oh, I've got this great trick for you. I just put the cookies, whatever it is. And for some things like the cookies, the soda, whatever you're trying to avoid, putting them away, further away, upstairs, adding to the cost, nudges that you do to yourself, those are phenomenal. I think they're good things to learn. But a lot of the things that are, I think, essential to the life well lived are harder than the things you might learn in a class. And I'm curious if, what do you think of that?
Well, I'd love you to elaborate on the harder things, right? Not just the hacks, like, oh, I probably shouldn't have Girl Scout cookies in the house because I'm going to eat all of the Thin Mints in one sitting, which most of us have done at least once. What are those harder things that you might have in mind, Russ, that are not exactly in this category?
So one of the things, I would put, I think a lot of these challenges that we're talking about, you and I are joking about the cookies, but they're about forms of self-control, and grit and perseverance are just one aspect of that. Making sacrifices for others that don't just make you feel good. Mm-hmm. In fact, they might not make you feel good. They might hurt, but you might do them anyway. And why? under what circumstances, thinking about what those circumstances might be. I like to use the example of a funeral of someone that you were close to. And it's so easy to rationalize not going. I mean, the person's dead. You could say they're not going to know whether I'm there or not. In fact, they don't even want me to go. They probably would prefer that I
Right. You can always create that. And you're wondering whether there is a kind of education, a kind of character development, which is qualitatively different for the big decisions about
exactly.
who we are. Okay.
Well, that's a small one. That's a small one in a way. I think it's actually not really a small one, those kind of decisions. And I would just say, here's a life hack that I like. And so I'm not against life hacks. When you're in a situation like that and you have a dilemma, it's not a bad idea to get outside counsel. So that you, meaning a friend, a loved one, a confidant, a mentor, who might be able to help you step outside your usual
take some
urges.
Mm-hmm.
And get some perspective.
Outside the ego perspective.
Yeah. So you need both. You need a life hack. You need some deeper thinking, I think, about who you want to be and who you are. That's what I'd say.
I agree, right? So you could say that there are some kind of trivial small c character choices that we make. You might regret eating a whole box of Thin Mint cookies, but it's not the kind of thing on your deathbed that you're going to worry too much about. I mean, unless you do it every day. I also think there are
you may get there sooner. If you're not careful.
Yes, almost certainly. If you want to say that there are big C character choices, right? Like the more significant ones. And Russ, you give the example of a funeral. I had this exact choice last week. Dear friend and prominent scholar Sigal Barsaid, who was a Wharton professor, died. She was 56, and it was a year-long battle with a brain tumor. So it was both expected and unexpected. The family and Sigal decided to have the funeral and the burial in Los Angeles. And I had a choice. I got an email from Jonathan. I think it was 2 days before. I teach on Wednesday nights. I thought to myself, okay, funeral's Thursday morning. Also, I had unmovable commitments on, I have to do a global webinar, on the morning, before that. So I was looking at all these flights and I'm thinking, okay, if I take this flight and if my husband, spirits me to the airport and I, get TSA pre and this works out and that works out. And if I have a car meet me there, and if I can stay at this particular hotel, if all of these things happen, then maybe I can go. And it took me about, 30 to 45 seconds to decide that that's what I should do. And I'm actually, Russ, I'm kind of embarrassed that it took me that long. It should have taken me 1 second to say yes. Yes, you don't not show up for the funeral of somebody you truly loved. And I have made that mistake before. I will tell you that the airline gods were with me. Everything worked out. I'm forever going to be grateful and proud that I made the right decision. I didn't screw that one up. I will never forget the things that were said at the service, which was beautiful. And I remember thinking, because I had to take effectively 2 red eyes to make this all work. And, the next day, of course, I had my full schedule. I took my office hours with my students by Zoom in the parking lot, walking around with my phone, which I had also timed when to charge it so it wouldn't die, so that I could do all this. And I was, in some ways physically exhausted, but I remember thinking to myself, this feels so right. And that to me is also, maybe the hidden side of character. It's not because you'll be richer or that even people will like you more, but when you develop character and when you manifest the aspirational self that you would like to be, but aren't always, it just feels so right. And I don't even know that happy captures the sense, that you have. And I have made a mistake in the past that was not like that. I mean, there were 2 weddings that I should have gone to that I failed to go to. And I can't exactly remember the exact circumstances. There was also a time when a friend was in the hospital in a different state. And I am sure there were extenuating circumstances. And like you said, you
always are.
right? You could say, oh, a rational
Always.
agent wouldn't do this. And to this day, I regret those failures of character of mine. And the question is there any role for, a class that you take or some kind of formal character development or something that, other than just life experience that enables you to develop character more rapidly, I guess, for lack of a better word. And I do think so. I mean, when I ask myself, like, why did I make different choices this week than I have in the past? I mean, it is in part because of what I've read. It is in part because of things that, wiser people have told me. And it is in part because I've, studied as an academic, self-control and I understand better that when we are in difficult choices, like, well, on one hand, I'm exhausted. On the other hand, I should probably go to that wedding. That like I understand the decision-making process better. And I think I am able to make wiser choices because of all of that.
And, I think grit or perseverance are part of this. I think, I don't know you very well, but I have a feeling you're pretty, you're a high achiever, pretty confident about that, and kind of focused,
oriented.
Yeah, kind of good at doing things and not procrastinating and so
I don't
on.
Procrastinate.
Yeah, I don't think
not
so. I'm
usually,
just guessing. But some people, and I'm not going to, I'll let you comment. I think some people see improving grit or perseverance is a matter of productivity. It's a question of being better workers, being a better student, and being able to then get a better job, make more money, contribute more to the economy. And I hate that. I'm just going on a limb. And I think that's the wrong way to think about it. And I wonder how you think about it and whether you are part of, I think a lot of people, I assume there are people who like your work just for that reason and nothing else. And I'm curious what your thoughts are.
I think people who would hear that Russ Roberts and Angela Duckworth don't think that the point of grit ultimately is just productivity would be surprised, right? Because, a Chicago economist and somebody who writes all about achievement and fills her book with examples of, Olympic athletes and Nobel laureates, it would be an obvious inference to make. And it's true that I do believe that, when you want to reverse engineer excellence, it's in a way, it's like the easy thing to do is to like look at who has won an award or done something that has objectively been deemed excellent by society. But here's what I think the ultimate telos, right? The ultimate point of grit is, right? The end of that. I think what happiness is alignment of your goals. There is a kind of, I'm doing my wants and my second order wants. I'm doing what I want to want and what I want. And there isn't a lot of conflict of sort of like, oh, but I'm tortured. When I look at really gritty people who pursue with a kind of a passion that they don't have any other words for other than romantic terms, I love what I do. I'm passionate about what I do. I mean, these are the terms that we would use for our husband or wife. These are the kind of people who feel unconflicted. If you imagine that a person is a collection of arrows, so the cover of Grit, which of course is done by an artist, not me, it's got this big arrow going to the right and then all these little arrows that are against you. And the idea is like, you're gritty and you're opposing all the outside forces, right? But you know what gritty people are? If you could look inside, like they are a bunch of arrows. The thing is that their goals are all pointing in the same direction. Like they have a unity, a kind of a purpose that's coherent. And I have felt times in my life, conflict. It's like, oh, I kind of should go to medical school because my dad really wants me to go to medical school, but I feel this pull to kids and education. And that was deep conflict and a lot of misery for me and my dad, by the way. I think to me, the telos of grit is this alignment of purpose where what you do during the day is aligned with your values. It's aligned with your interests. When you think of the 5 things that you have to do, they're all part of a whole. They're like, oh, right, because I have a superordinate goal that those 5 things serve. And to me, that is much more important than did you or did you not win the Nobel Prize. And there is a kind of again, happiness fails, I think, to describe this, but a kind of rightness, a kind of peace, a kind of harmony that I at least experience when the more I am like that. And I hate the corrosive feeling of being at war with myself. So grit to me is more about alignment than it is about achievement.
Yeah, the word I would use is flourish. You flourish when you can harness your skills
Flourish
in
is
a
better
direction.
than happy, right? Like flourishing.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. It means you're harnessing your skills in the direction that you want to use them. But I do think there's I'm going to pick on economics for a minute. In economics, we're always talking about maximizing. And I think if we're not careful, we forget about exploration. In my new book, I talk about we're really good at getting to where we need to go, but we don't spend enough time thinking about where we want to go in the first place. And there's a lot to be said for wandering. Not aimless wandering, not mindless wandering necessarily, a little bit of that at times. But, I think the risk of overemphasizing grit or perseverance or success or whatever, however you want to couch it, that's less material, the idea of getting the most out of life, which is something I've used myself, which I now have some regret about using that phrase, because it's always forward, like overcome those other arrows, get ahead.
Leap over that obstacle.
Yeah, nothing's going to stop me. Nothing can stop me. And there's sometimes you should stop. There's some things you're pursuing that actually they might not be so good for you, or you might not. They might not be your best interest, like going to medical school. It's okay to give up because you realize, hey man, this is not me. It's not what I want. And I think that tension between what we might call persistence, perseverance, grit, and thoughtfulness, mindfulness, uncertainty.
Yeah, and wandering, right? Exploration. Yeah. So let me suggest that the key word here is toggling. Right. I agree with you that if you think about grit as being, steadfastly pursuing a goal and just like one step in front of the other, one foot in front of the other, relentlessly without rest, that doesn't allow very much that mental picture for wandering, for exploration, for saying like, wait a second, before taking one more step in this direction, like maybe I'm even heading for the wrong mountain range, right? So I think the toggling is this, and whether you call this all sort of what grit really is, if you really understand it, or if you think that's a cheat and you just want to say like grit has to be toggled with this other thing, is kind of semantics. But the toggling is I think what a lot of ethologists who study animal behavior would call the tension between the exploration and exploitation modes of foraging, for example. So if you are a little bird and you come upon a new meadow, and you start, picking, seeds out of the grass or worms, right? And this little patch is pretty good, right? You have a choice at any time to move on to a new patch and to explore. I don't know, maybe that patch over there is even better. Maybe there are more worms and seeds. Or you can exploit this patch, right? And that's the exploitation trade-off. You always have to make this choice. And there's a cost either way, which is opportunity cost. And the question is like, when does the bird move? And one could argue that that's essentially what we have in life. Should I try this, completely different direction, read a different book, try a different internship, or should I just really specialize and go forward in this one direction? So should I explore or should I exploit? So I think one thing that the animal behavior scientists would agree is that the trade-off has a certain dynamic, which is, first of all, it's never like all of one or the other. So there's always a toggling. They would also say, I think, early on in a meadow that you're exploring or in a lifespan, exploration is privileged because you just don't know. Right. So the calculus benefits exploration because you know less and you also have longer to live to exploit. And then, of course, if you're like towards the end of your life and you're just trying to figure out who you are and what you want to do, and you're 80, like then you've sort of gotten the calculus wrong because, the clock is running out. And also you should have had 80 years to figure out a lot. So then exploitation is favored. So the toggling has a kind of lifespan shift from one, center of gravity to the other. But there's new research by somebody who I absolutely think you should have as a guest. Russ, he's so brilliant. His name is Dashan Wang, and he was a physicist, but he became a Kellogg professor not too many years ago. And he, like me, is kind of obsessed with achievement and with the dynamics of human excellence. And what he's done is applied kind of artificial intelligence and like very sophisticated modeling techniques to enormously large data sets to ask questions about, for example, the value of exploration versus the value of exploitation. And one of my favorite papers, he identifies that these periods of exploitation of a good idea can be called hot streaks. And he looked at three large data sets, scientists, painters, and Hollywood, or anyway, movie directors. I guess they don't have to all be in Hollywood. And he has these like three big databases, and he can measure impact of your work through, citations, or, how much your painting sold at auction, or, IMDb ratings. And what he finds is that across these three very different creative professions, there are hot streaks that last between 4 and 5 years. The modal number is 1. So most people have a hot streak, but most of them relative to themselves. I mean, they're not all Steven Spielberg, but, for themselves, they have a high impact period of their career. And very few people have 2. It's exceedingly rare to have 3. But the most interesting thing to me about what fell out of this research was that Dashan wanted to know, like, what begins a hot streak? Like, where do they come from? And what he found is that there's a period of exploration. I mean, he uses Van Gogh as an example. So Van Gogh really struggled for a time, mostly when he was painting in Paris. And before the paintings we all know and love, right? The sunflowers and so forth. And if you look at the paintings that Van Gogh did while he was in Paris, I mean, they're not bad, right? But, they're not also as good as the ones that we all recognize. And during that period of exploration, he was trying different techniques. He was quitting certain things that were like kind of dead ends. And then when he moved to the south of France, he had a hot streak. He had a period of exploitation of techniques that emerged during the exploration period as really terrific. He uses Jackson Pollock as another example, and there are of course others. And I think to me it says that when people ask the question like, I want to be excellent at what I do, I want to have, a goal that I'm aligned to in every possible way, it doesn't mean really that you have to put one foot in front of the other without rest, for your whole life. It means that you might need to toggle between periods of, extraordinary focus. And then, just as you said, Russ, a kind of wandering. But I'll add this final note on all of this research, which is that if you look at Van Gogh's life in more detail, so David Epstein, the writer we both admire, and somebody who's thinking I admire a lot, he, like me, got a little obsessed with Dashan Wang's paper, and he wrote a short essay about this. It's on his website, where he finds a letter that Van Gogh wrote to his brother before he had the hot streak, right? And just the angst and the torture of like not knowing where you're going is so clear. But I think David's essay makes a beautiful point, which is that there is a difference between wandering without any intention of ever having some focus and wandering with the intention to have some focus. And I think that kind of wandering where you're exploring, but you hope at some point to be walking in a slightly straighter line with more progress. I think that really is qualitatively different. And when I reflect on my own life, I wandered for 10 years between graduating from college and starting my PhD. And that was a torturous 10 years. But I will tell you, Russ, I was wandering with intention. I knew I wanted to be an expert in something. I was not content to do things for 1 year at a time, 2 years at a time, and constantly making pivots.
While you were talking, I was thinking of David Epstein because his book Range, which we talked about here on EconTalk, certainly talks about the value of trying different things. I think it came up in my episode with Lauren Buckman on his book, Make to Know, where a lot of times you're waiting to see what emerges, but it's not mindless waiting. You're attentive. And that's what the wandering ideally is. Although it's okay to wander aimlessly now and then, I think.
Yeah, you can have a little wandering for your own sake, too.
Exactly.
I mean,
it keeps recharge the battery.
Everything has to be intentional.
Right. And I also thought about, we had Ben Cohen on here talking about the hot hand, which is very much about these episodes of incredible productivity, where, again, productivity isn't just you're making more widgets, just your soul sort of comes to life and you have your greatest work for a great artist like Van Gogh. But I want to take us in a different direction. I want to throw you a curveball something you said made me think about. You're talking about the bird in the meadow, and Travis to decide whether to focus on this particular patch or whether to try to explore something else. And I've been looking at a lot of birds lately, walking to work, which I hadn't been doing before. And I'm on the streets of Jerusalem, and we've got these big hooded crows. They're pecking at stuff. They're really interesting looking birds. And we have smaller birds. And you have to ask yourself, how intentional is that bird? The brain of that bird is really, really small.
Hence
and we don't really
bird brain.
Yeah, well said. And I don't think we know much about the animal world and how much they look ahead. I think very little, but I'm open-minded about that, agnostic. I'm assuming it's possible they look ahead more than we would imagine with their brains, but they're small. And the bird is very impulsive. You can see it pecking and looking and nervous and shooting over here and shooting over there. And if you had a cam on the bird, and there are such, you can watch them. I think there are such things. A bird spends its day flitting here to there, over here, maybe chasing things, running away from things, and the same thing is happening all around us in Jerusalem. We've got this great population of feral cats here that I happen to like and photograph, and some of them are fed by strangers, which is really interesting. But they're all street cats. They're just wandering around of different colors and shapes. And I'm thinking, what's going on in there? They're wandering around here. Some of them are relatively friendly. They'll look at me and I'll take their picture, and it's almost as if they're saying, "Yeah, appreciate that." And others are like, "You're taking my picture? How dare you?" And they run away, and some are afraid of me, just like human beings. And then I think, are we that different? I have a colleague here at Shalom College in the philosophy department, Yuval Delev, and he says, maybe how much of our actual decision-making is intentional?
Versus
so
reactive.
Many of the things that happen, not even reactive. We don't even understand why we're all of a sudden
like just
find
automatic
ourselves,
and,
we find ourselves in some new situations, and we'll tell ourselves a story as to why we made that decision. But really, we're kind of the whim of certain things. He's not saying that's what he believes, but he wonders about it. And it's a thoughtful question. So my question is, am I really that different from the bird and the cat? I mean, I think I am. I like to think I am. And I wrote a book about decision-making, and you've written a book about control and grit, and you teach a class on it. And are we living an illusion here? Do we have the free will that we think we have to mold ourselves, or are we just telling ourselves a story after the fact?
Well, let's start with how we're the same as a big black crow, right? Or a feral cat. And then let's talk about how we're different, because I think we are both the same and we are different. So I do think that more and more behavioral scientists, including Wendy Wood, who's arguably the world expert on habits, and she has a book, and it's called Good Habits, Bad Habits, and I recommend it. She has discovered in her recent research that so much of our behavior is unconscious. It's habitual, and we make up stories. So she has a study where, you in careful ways, measure how much coffee people drink and, when they drink it, but also you ask them, why did you drink coffee that day? And they always have a reason. They think, oh, because I was tired, because I really needed it. But really, actually, the data suggests a different story, which is that it's just a habit. It's just automatic. And just as you say, we create a narrative in retrospect that isn't really accurate. So I agree with you that we are like crows and feral cats, I guess domestic cats too, right? In that I think a lot of our behavior is instinctive, unreflective, non-consciously ordered. Just we do it, but it's not at all the kind of behavior that we recognize as like our choices, our decisions, and our free will. So that's how we are like cats and crows. But I think there is a reason why we have such a big brain, Russ, or at least this is an affordance of having a big brain, especially a big prefrontal cortex, which is one of the key distinguishing features of the human brain, even compared to our closest primates, that we have an enormous prefrontal cortex, right? The most recently evolved part of the brain. And I do believe that research, because, we have actually put, believe it or not, pigeons, for example, maybe not crows, but pigeons into the lab and given them delay of gratification tasks. If you peck this lever, you get a pellet right away. But if you can wait, then you can, like press this lever and then you press the lever and there's a delay, but then 3 pellets come out, right? And we know from that research that there's some ability for a lower order animal than a human to wait, to delay gratification, but not much. So there is a difference in future orientation. I think it's inarguable that human beings are able to envision with HD detail, a future 5, 10, 20 years from now. People are thinking about what will happen to this planet if we keep going this way in 100 years. And that does not seem possible for your typical crow or cat. And I think the question that we were coming to earlier, free will and the philosopher Harry Frankfurt's idea that perhaps what is uniquely human is that we not only have wants, but we have second order wants. Second orders are what I want to want. The complexity of human thought is not only to envision possible futures, but to ask the question, not only how am I responding, but how do I want to respond? When a friend really needs me in the future, I think unlike a crow or a cat, I can say, I deeply regret missing those 2 weddings. I deeply regret not seeing my friend in the hospital. I want to go to see the next friend who really needs me. And I am going to change my behavior. So I am a believer in free will and the uniquely human capacity to imagine possible futures and to make at least some choices intentionally. Maybe it's not the majority of my behaviors, but I do believe that at least some of my choices and behaviors are made with conscious awareness and that I have agency.
As beautifully said. I like to think about the stimulus we face. The crow smells something over here, goes. The cat sees a predator, runs. We have the ability to stand our ground if in the face of danger and help someone who might need our help. We have the ability, rare perhaps, but I think we have the ability to avoid temptation that crow has more trouble with maybe than we do. There's an episode coming out. By the time our episode airs, it will have aired. It's been recorded with Luca Delano. He calls the brain a confabulation device. It basically is, its main purpose is to tell us stories about that rationalize what we do. And he's onto something there, obviously. But you're suggesting, and I think correctly, and he's also interested in this, like, is there room to see if that story is really the one you want to tell yourself, the one that you have to listen to, the one only that you only tell yourself ex post? Maybe you could tell it ex ante if you chose to. But I think a lot of what the self-control or growing up that I was referring to at the very beginning of our conversation is about not responding to stimuli, is to find that space, which is really hard, where instead of impulsively doing what seems that drives you, you take a breath, you pause, and you think, is this what I want to do? And of course, wandering can help you get better at that, I think.
In some ways, it's a question of, are you going to live life like you're the object of the sentence, or are you going to live life as the subject of the sentence? And I think agency is saying, like, I ate the cake. Not the cake was eaten by me, or like, the cake was there and then of course I had to eat it. But like, it's I ate the cake. And Walter Mischel, who of course was the one of the greatest psychologists ever, and he's of course passed now, but he invented the Marshmallow Test to measure delay of gratification and the ability to control oneself. He often, as a developmental psychologist, Walter primarily worked with young children. And he would say that when children are born, they are entirely stimulus driven, right? Like they just react, kind of like a crow or a cat, and they're babies. And it was very influenced by Freud, that, which people might not realize, because he was a very empirically driven scientist. And of course, Freud wasn't. But the term delayed gratification comes from Freud. Freud said that when a child matures, perhaps the most important thing they are able to do is delay the gratification of their impulses and to not be stimulus driven, for our entire lives. And to me, I feel like the project of developing our character is to say, life happens for sure, right? Let's say that life is a stimulus. And I do believe that, our project in life is to decide how we're going to deal with it. You get a diagnosis of a brain tumor that happens to you, but agentically, when you're the subject of the sentence, like, how do you respond to it? Do you respond to it with bravery and dignity or not? Your friend calls you and says, I really need you to come visit. For me, that was a failure of my character. I did not visit my friend. I failed to be loyal in that moment. And the next opportunity I have, I hope not to. So I do think that there is a kind of, rich philosophical and psychological context in which this, question of whether we're, the objects of the sentence or the subjects of the sentence, which is true. And of course, they're both partly true. But I think trying to live life with an idea that you're the subject of the sentence is the better way.
And certainly Viktor Frankl's book, Man's Search for Meaning, is an example of what you're talking about the things happen to you, but how you respond to them are up to you.
How many times have you read that? I've read it like 6
only
times.
Once. I've only read it once.
You have many. It's so good. Keep going. It's just like watching Love Actually. It just gets better and better.
Angela,
yeah,
I've always liked you. I always liked you, but now my respect for you is taken on a new level.
I didn't know which way that was going to go.
Yeah, Love Actually.
We should watch that together, Russ.
It's a barometer.
It is. It's a barometer.
A lot of people hate it. It is. A lot of people hate that movie, which shocks me. I've seen it 5 or 6 times. I know it. I know a lot of it by heart.
Like those people profoundly.
Okay, we'll keep that. Maybe we'll edit that out. I'm kidding, Les. Keep that in. Don't edit that out. I had planned that we would talk more about this question of delayed gratification than we ended up talking about. But I do think it's an interesting example that you mentioned it like everybody knows what it is, but the marshmallow test is this idea that if you can avoid eating the marshmallow that's in front of you right away and get a larger reward in a few minutes, that correlated with people's lifetime outcomes, that it was a character trait, not just a learned behavior. And I have to mention that work has come under attack recently. Some people suggest that it doesn't replicate, or it didn't replicate in their work, attempt to find that again. But it's a deep question about whether this is an aspect of yourself or whether it's something you can acquire. In other words, is it destiny? If you're a person who can't delay gratification, you'll never be able to go to grad school, you're going to flunk out of, et cetera, and you won't do well in life. Or is it something you can acquire? And I think that is, as you point out in the essay that we started talking about, is a really fundamental question about the way psychologists look at the world and human beings.
So this is the most important thing that I try to teach my students. I say, the human mind is a kind of either or machine. I want to know what the answer is. Is it either that character is fixed or is it developable? Is it either the person or the situation? And I will say that, the vast majority of scientific research that I'm familiar with on any aspect of human functioning that you can imagine always has the answer of both and. Right. So let's take the marshmallow test. It has come under attack. I think less because it doesn't replicate, but more because because it's a correlational finding that how long you wait for the marshmallow correlates with things like income later on in adulthood. And the major complaint is that if you statistically control for all the things that you ought to, that the correlation is really small. And if you control for some things, you could argue it's like hardly different from zero. Okay, then there's counter arguments, by the way, that, you've kind of controlled for things like self-control. And so, of course, the correlation goes down. Yeah. But just to abbreviate, what's obviously a complex conversation about that, Walter Mischel was famous not for one thing, but for 2 things. One was the creation of the marshmallow test, which was popularly understood as, if how long you can wait for 2 marshmallows at age 4 predicts your lifetime income, that's kind of your character is destiny. This is a fixed trait. because look, I can measure it at 4, and you're still being influenced by it when you're 34 or 44 or 54. Like that's the popular understanding. But let's think about what Walter was also famous for. The other thing that Walter was famous for in psychology is the power of the situation. And what Walter was getting at was that when we think of any behavior, how you act in the Marshmallow Test, how you act on the job, whether you decide to cheat on your taxes or not cheat on your taxes, is both a function of the person, their character, and the situation. Not either the person or the situation, both the person and the situation. And just to blow minds a little bit, because students look at me and they're just like, their brows are creased, and their brow, it's like they just don't. It's like, I'm like, yeah, right, because you're gonna have to think really hard about this. When I talk about character, I want you to think of it as both being somewhat stable, right? Like, yeah, I saw Russ in 2016. I have a sense of who Russ is, his values, his leanings, and his love Actually, right? Like, that's probably not going to change very much. And so both that there's stability and that there's change. Character is both stable and malleable. The behavior that we observe in each other and ourselves is both a product of our character and of the situation. So I know this complexity doesn't sell well. It's hard to make a TikTok video. I don't think it'll go viral. But to me, I feel like a lot of the polarization that every country, including the United States, has experienced is a product of either or thinking. Either you believe in this or you believe in that. Is it possible? And I wonder whether you're optimistic or pessimistic about this, that with our big prefrontal cortex, like with our big brains, we could potentially accommodate, the both and reality of human development and human nature?
Well, I try to do my little small part by reminding people that it's complicated. It's complicated is my way of saying
both
it's
and.
not. It's
complicated.
Yeah, and so
nature nurture, it's complicated.
Yeah,
right?
It doesn't sell that well, but
Yeah, it's
I think
complicated. It's not sexy.
Is that a bumper sticker? But
Yeah.
I'm sure a listener right now will prove me
Yes.
wrong.
Please send us bumper stickers.
I'm sure they will. I'm sure they will.
Okay,
Somebody will create one. We'll put it up at the EconTalk. We'll put it on the EconTalk
put it on my computer.
store. We'll put it in our swag store. I want to close with a comment, something I learned from Mike Munger, longtime EconTalk guest. He was visiting me one time, and we were watching one of my kids play baseball on his team, on my kid's team. And one of my kids, I can't remember whether it was the team or my kid, it was a stressful game. And, it was baseball. Baseball can be a particularly challenging activity, hitting a fast-moving object with a small stick or trying to catch it with a small glove. And I said something about sports building character, and he said, "Sports doesn't build character; it reveals it." And I still get goosebumps when I think about it, because it's certainly true that when you put a 16-year-old or 14-year-old kid in a situation of stress in public in front of their peers, and they are on stage and they fail at least 2 times out of 3, usually in baseball as a batter, it kind of tests a person. How are you going to respond to this? And we're going to watch that in real time and in real space. And it's actually a quite beautiful thing, I think, about being a parent. I've not thought about it enough, to watch your children encounter. One of the great things I think about your kids playing sports is to watch that. And I think Mike was right, but of course he was wrong. And I'm sure he'd agree with us that it both reveals and builds. It's both. It's complicated. And the way you respond to defeat is not destiny. It's not written in your genes. You have a chance. Somebody throws a tantrum or doesn't do well after failing, has a chance to rise above that. And they may not do it for a long time. It may take them a lifetime, but they can. And I think that's part of what we've been saying today.
I think our circumstances both reveal our character and develop our character, because human nature, it's complicated. And on my gravestone, if they would allow more than one word, then I don't want it to be grit. both and, right? Like, I mean, to me, my mission in life, Russ, is to increase psychological literacy. And I think as we move forward into the 21st century, and if we're ever going to come together again as communities, and truly develop character, then we have to actually embrace both and its complexity. And I don't think that leaves us like hopelessly confused, actually. In the end, I think it gives us more agency and compassion at the same time, understanding that we can be the subject of our sentence, but in some ways we're all the object of the sentence. It really is both and in almost every scenario that I can imagine. And I'm glad to have had this conversation, because I do think conversations like this get us a little closer to that complexity and that nuance.
My guest today has been Angela Duckworth. Angela, thanks for being part of EconTalk.
Thanks, Russ. I hope I see you again.
This is EconTalk, part of the Library of Economics and Liberty. For more EconTalk, go to econtalk.org, where you can also comment on today's podcast and find links and readings related to today's conversation. The sound engineer for EconTalk is Rich Goyette. I'm your host, Russ Roberts. Thanks for listening. Talk to you on Monday.